3, 2, 1. All right, thank you everybody for joining us for today's event, which is a debate titled "The Olympics of Evil." Does it matter? What's the full title? Does it matter which side is worse? Something like that. But the topic of discussion is the recent article by Dr. Andrew Bernstein. The left is vastly more evil than religious conservatives. The link for that article, if you haven't read it, is in the description of the YouTube video, and there's also a link on Meetup if that's where you came to this event from. I always encourage people to like, share, subscribe, and all that stuff, and I encourage people even more so today, especially the objectivists in the audience, to share this with your non-objectivist friends. They might not agree with both our speakers, but it would be nice to show people how two people can strongly disagree on a topic, and I think you two do strongly disagree on this topic, and be civilized and discuss and maybe convince each other, maybe not, but remain friends afterwards. So I suggest we start with Dr. Bernstein. Maybe for people who haven't read your article, maybe you can give sort of the general points, and then Dr. Binswanger will reply. By the way, I should say, uh, because I know the speakers can handle it, there is no moderator for this debate. So I will be here for the Q&A. Anybody who has a question in Zoom can raise their hand. On YouTube can do a super chat, and we will get the question to the speakers. Dr. Bernstein.
I don't know, Razi. I mean, Dr. Binswanger is notorious for shouting people down and not letting anybody speak, and we may need a moderator.
Will you be quiet there?
It's like Trump, right? You keep interrupting and yelling and everything.
So this is not necessarily a formal debate. This is an argument between two opposed viewpoints. Okay.
I'm not even sure how much we disagree, since we agree that both sides are horrendously evil. But I think there is some disagreement here, and Razi's right. It'll all be very, very civilized, whether we disagree strongly or not.
Well, let's begin and find out.
Okay. All right. Well, then, my essay, "The Left is Vastly More Evil Than Religious Conservatives," was published recently. I want to thank Mark Dacuna at capitalismmagazine.com for publishing it. And I'll just give the gist of it in my opening statement, and then, Dr. Binswanger will respond, and I'll have other responses to his responses. But the gist of the essay was to show that historically, Christianity is horrendously evil. I mean, it's a faith-based monolithic philosophy that shuts down dissent and burns heretics at the stake. I don't even know. I don't know if anybody knows how many heretics they've burned, at the stake over more than 1,000 years. Not to mention members of other religions, infidels that they murder. So it's a horrendous evil because it stifles in independent judgment. And yet, as evil as they are, and it's like we're talking about millimeters of evil here, but I think there is a point to the millimeters here. As evil as they are, their philosophy holds some element of individuality. The soul is personal. It's my soul or your soul. It comes from God, and it gives the individual some degree of dignity and of respect. And they have the Christians have some attenuated commitment to free will. Even at the height of their power, heretics could, or who are Catholic or Protestants, or claim to be Catholics or Protestants, but who disagree with the orthodoxy on some important theological point or other, heretics could spare their lives by recanting or converting to the orthodoxy. And similarly, if infidels, who are non-believers in the one true faith, could spare their lives by converting. So there's some element of respect for free will. It's a brutal choice that the religionists offer, convert or die. But there's some last shred of respect for free will there. And so my moral status, or any individual's moral status, to some degree rests upon free will, upon the choice I make. Whereas, for the collectivists, for the communists or the National Socialists, evil is baked into me. It's a brutal. They hold a brutally determinist theory that for the Nazis, of course, if I'm one of the inferior races, it's hardwired into my biology, and there's no converting to Aryan blood. And for the communists, if I'm raised in the bourgeoisie, then I'm necessarily a exploitative of the working class, and I'm an enemy of the working class, and there's no way to change that. And so, fighting race war and class war, they just murder millions of people. There's no offer of convert or die. And maybe above all, to me, what makes the collectivists worse is they conduct an unremitting war against individuality. There's no respect for the individual. Human nature is this amorphous. It's like the Borg in Star Trek. It's just this amorphous totality, and an individual is just like an appendage. You sever your left arm or your finger from the whole organism, and it shrivels up and dies. It can't go on. That's what's known as the organic theory of the state. It goes all the way back to Plato's Republic. And the individual is nothing. I mean, and Leonid Peikoff brilliantly described Hegel as a post-Kantian Platonist. And Hegel's the grandfather of the modern collectivist movement. And the individual is nothing to them. What does the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian communists, say to their victims? Losing you is no loss. Keeping you is no specific gain. The individual is nothing. All that matters is the working class. All that matters is the group of the collective. That, I think, is what makes the collectivists even more evil than the Christians. They conduct an unremitting campaign against individuality. It's not even real to them, never mind of moral significance. And that's why I think it's those philosophic reasons that account for the vastly higher murder rate amongst the collectivists than amongst the Christians. I mean, millions and millions and 100 million for the communists in less than a century. And so anyway, in my essay, I also addressed the technological point that some people think that if the Dark Age Christians had gas chambers and machine guns available to them, their murder count would have been as high. But I pointed out, that the Genghis Khan claimed to have murdered 40 million people in the 13th century using swords and and spears and fire and stuff. And Stalin's favorite weapon of mass murder was starvation. You take all the food, and you deliberately starve the peasants to death. You don't need modern technology to do that. You get two sticks you grew up together, start a fire. You could burn all the crops. I think the vastly higher murder count amongst the communists and National Socialists is due to their utter rejection of individuality, that the individual is worthless, whereas the Christians have some last shred of respect for individuality and free will. And that's why I think their murder count is lower. Now, after Dr. Binswanger responds, I'll have something to say about the medieval Renaissance and why I think that's significant, but I don't want to go on too long, so I'll just turn it over to Harry.
I thought you would give your whole paper, but it's
what?
enough to plunge into that point if you prefer that.
What about the medieval Renaissance?
Yeah, but
all right, I could do a
okay, yeah, do that.
Yeah, all right. I mean, Albert the Great, Albertus Magnus, that nobody knows his exact dates, but he's 13th century. He's often 1190 to 1280 or 1200 to 1280. Thomas Aquinas, also 13th century, 1225 to 1274. This is Christianity at the height of its powers. I mean, they're conducting, and all the Christian brutality, they're conducting crusades against the Muslims in the Middle East at this point. They're burning the Catharist heretics by the thousands in France. They're fighting wars against the Muslims in Spain. Christianity is at the height of its brutal powers, and yet we get these. And Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas were both clergy. They were Dominican. They were Dominican monks, and yet they're attracted. This is during the golden age of Islam, and which is real, by the way. It's not politically correct propaganda. Muslims make great advances in science and in literature and in a number of fields, and they were Aristotle scholars. And the Western Europeans Aristotle had been lost, except for his writings on logic, for centuries, and in the constant wars against Muslims in Spain, for example, the Catholics came, found the Greek manuscripts translated into Arabic now. And by the way, Archbishop Raymond I of Toledo had a whole translation movement going to translate Aristotle from Arabic into Latin, the language of European scholars, the way the Muslims had centuries before translating Aristotle from Greek into Arabic. And you took your life in your hands back then. You got to give these Catholic heroes a lot of credit. Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas are the two most famous, but there were others who were fascinated by Aristotle, who wanted to study Aristotle, wanted to teach Aristotle. The University of Paris, for example, wanted to teach Aristotelian principles and study nature the way Aristotle had. It all clashed with Catholic teachings, and these guys were heroes. They took their lives in their hands, going against a dogmatic religious orthodoxy, and yet they not only survived, they triumphed. Aristotle became the Aristotelians eventually took the intellectual high ground. They took over the universities and they taught Aristotle. Now, this is a bastardized version of Aristotle, the scholastics, and they impeded the advance of science centuries later. But in the 13th century, this is a revolution. This is bringing Aristotelian philosophy and his commitment to nature and reason and rational philosophy and science, into the medieval universities. This never happened under the collectivists. Granted, their history is much shorter, but in fact, it never happened. I can't even conceive of. Well, I'll leave my imagination out of this because my imagination is not part of any logical argument. But 1970s, let's say, when Brezhnev was still in power, if some Soviet apparatchik, somebody in the Soviet regime, the way Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas were monks and part of the Catholic regime. So let's study Ayn Rand, boys. Let's read Atlas, translate Atlas Shrugged into Russian, and let's study Ayn Rand and glorify a rational philosophy. It didn't happen. What would have happened? Now we're speculating, but I don't imagine those guys would have lasted long before they got sent off to a Siberian gulag. There's just the communist and National Socialist ideologies just have no respect for the individual. There's not, zero. And independent thinkers are just completely squashed, whereas under the Catholics, I think the successes of Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas. Let me wrap it up with this. On a scale of 1 to 100, where 100 is in political independence and the kind of spiritual independence that Ayn Rand showing us in the founding, under the Christians, maybe you get 1 or 2 out of 100. Under the collectives, you got 0. There's just no chance for an independent thinker to survive under the communists or Nazis. Never mind triumph. So I think that's an important point that tells us something about the difference.
Okay. Let me begin by saying what I think is good in Andy's paper, because there is good, and I recommend you read it to find out what this is all about. I'm going to disagree with the central thesis, but I want to name what's good. First of all, the grand scale perspective, which we've just seen, the looking at the biggest of big pictures over thousands of years and comparing two huge swaths. So he's not talking about single payer medical systems and whether that is supportable. He's talking about the role of Aristotle versus Plato in the medieval world, leading to the Renaissance, leading to the United States. So that is the kind of perspective you have to have in order to make sense of history. I also think it's unusual, and to his credit, that he looks to the content of the ideas. He's not going by a Marxist theory which says there are grand scale stages in history, and it's a matter of what the tools of production are. Under the feudal system, they had water wheels, but they didn't have steam engines, and so therefore they had feudalism. He's looking at what the theories actually hold, and that is the place to look to understand the sweep of history. And finally, I credit him and agree with him that Christianity has a introduction of respect for the individual soul, that most religions did not have. I guess no religion, I'm not sure about Judaism, but the Eastern religion certainly did not have it. And I think it's an introduction from Christianity that eventually led to modern individualism. Now, I heard that idea from Ayn Rand. It was I think she may have gotten it from Isabel Patterson, or it may have been common knowledge back when people used to be educated. You remember that, when people learned something?
When they could read.
When they could read. Yeah. I think there were a lot of tweets on that back in the early 20th century. So she said that Christianity had a respect for the individual soul that is missing in other movements and in other religions. I don't know how much to make of that, and I was always dubious about that, but Andy has picked up on that and made an issue of it, and I think it deserves attention. I think it has to be true to some extent. What I disagree with is a mixture of levels and his conclusions about the big picture, the grand scale level. By a mixture of levels, I mean that first of all, religion does not have a conceptual common denominator with collectivism. That for those who are not objectivists, you don't know the term conceptual common denominator, so let me rephrase it. There's not a single axis upon which religion is one place and collectivism is somewhere else. Religion is a whole philosophy with a metaphysics, an elaborate metaphysics, a theology, of course, a cosmology, a theory of history and of ethics and of politics. Collectivism is mainly an ethical political view. You can identify presuppositions in metaphysics and epistemology. For example, collectivism holds that what's really real is the collective, not the individual. That's a metaphysical position. And it necessarily holds determinism, the denial of free will. Andy referred to the organic theory of the state, and the big division between individualists and collectivists is over whether you are your own sovereign or not, whether you control your destiny. They like to say that the individual is to society as the cell is to the body. But the cell is controlled by the body. The cell is a deterministic unit, and the body makes the cell what it is. It grows out of the body, out of the embryo, and it controls it. So if a cell has to be killed to preserve the body, either because its DNA has gone wrong or because the organism is starving, the hormones necessary to do that and the lysosomes will go out and the cell will die. Or looking at a behavior level, if you're going to die because your finger is caught in a trap, you'll cut off your finger to save yourself. But that is not true of the individual in society. Society does not create and control and rule the individual because the individual does not have to agree with anyone else. Society is a group of individuals in a way that the cell is not just, the body is not just a group of cells. The individual possesses control over his own thinking, his own mind, and therefore his own actions in the course of his own life. So it is true that the issue of free will versus determinism is implied in collectivism. Collectivists have to be determinists. Nonetheless, Christianity and communism are not really on the same scale. And there are Christian communists. Yes, there are. Atheism is not a necessary part of communism at all. There are Christian Nazis. There were Christian Nazis. I remember the quote from someone that I found in my researches on the rise of Hitler. When Hitler was in power, there was a speech given that says, "We recognize only two gods, our God in heaven and Adolf Hitler, who is our God on earth." So they are not yin and yang or A and non-A. They are somewhat orthogonal to each other. They clash in certain areas and don't clash in others. So there's first a mix of things on different levels. You can contrast religion versus secularism. You can contrast collectivism versus individualism. But religion versus collectivism is a little bit skewed. Then there's the bigger issues, which are that there's a mixture of abstract and concrete. On one level, the paper is about such things as Marx versus Thomas Aquinas, and even that's a little too concrete. The grand sweep of history of the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, and then the history of collectivist movements starting in the late 19th century, right up to the present. But in another scale, it's about Trump versus Biden, the last election, the Senate races, and so forth. Andy doesn't go into that a lot, but that's kind of the motivation for it. And that's a very different thing. You cannot go from a premise that religion is worse in its social political doctrine than communism to, I should side in this election with the religious candidate to stop the left. That just does not follow. And it would be, maybe in the next election, argued the other way. It may be that you should vote for the religious conservative to stop the Bernie Sanders type candidate. But then it may be that you should vote for Joe Biden to stop Donald Trump. I'm not here to argue one or the other, but they just don't follow from the grand scale perspective that Andy wants to talk about here. And finally, the third level of the mixture, or third mixture of levels, third aspect of that, is that there are different stages. So religion controlled the West. Christianity controlled the West for 1,000 years. From the fall of Rome in 476 to about 1492, when the Renaissance, at least what I was taught for various reasons, is dated from. And what it began as was something somewhat different than what it ended as. And the same is true for communism. Communism under Lenin was not communism under Gorbachev. And the beliefs of people in communist regimes changes with time. So I gave the analogy in a post between two forms of cancer. And it may be that pancreatic cancer is just exactly as bad as brain cancer. But it might be that early stage pancreatic cancer is better than late stage brain cancer. And it might be that early stage brain cancer is better than late stage pancreatic cancer. When I say better, I mean less evil, less destructive. So there's a kind of blindness to the different stages and the virulence of the doctrines at different stages in history. I will go more into that later. Now, I think he gets the grand scale, which I love that he went to. I think he gets it wrong. For instance, there's the issue of the body count, and there's the issue of conversion, right? More dead bodies under collectivism than under Christianity. You could convert and save your life. Yeah, but that's physical survival. What about the survival of your mind and spirit and values? There's nothing deadlier that I know of than pure Christianity. It is a living death, as Ayn Rand called it in her article of the living death. I would rather be a person under persecution in Soviet Russia, trying to elude the authorities and toe the line, even though it's probably better to be dead than that, than to be a medieval peasant who only knows 1,000 different words, who lives with lice, who has a life expectancy of 30, who has cannot read or write, has no human relations beyond the people in his family and the other 3 families in his little farming village. That is not a question that, it's not, oh boy, they let me live. They didn't kill me like they would have in communism. So now I can live the life of subhuman. That is not a positive. To give you an idea, to give you an idea of what we're dealing with, because it's not just about the Cathars murdering tens of thousands because they held a different idea. That's bad. But I have here 2 views of man. Pope Innocent III on the misery of man, contrasted with the Renaissance humanist Giannozzo Manetti, who I'm not going to read. I want to read you the Pope. This is from that exact same period, 1200 AD, that Albertus Magnus was able to get around this viewpoint. This is a Pope. This is a leader of Christianity. Let me deplore the miserable beginnings of human existence. Let me lament its sinful progress. Let me mourn its end in damnation. Accordingly, I should like to consider in tears 3 questions. First, what is the stuff man is made of? Second, what is man doing? Thirdly, what is the future of man? He's going to tell us here. Verily, man has been formed of dust, has been conceived in sin, was born to punishment. In his actions, he is evil, disgraceful, and deceitful. He does what he ought not to do, whatever is shameful and not profitable to. Man will become fuel for fire, the food of worms, a mass of putridity. Man is made of mud and ashes. Why are you proud, O mud? Wherefore art thou exalted? What are you, O ash, that you should boast? And there's just some sections that are particularly good. Happy are they who die before birth, who experience death before tasting life. And then on more, here we go. On the conception of children, where to children, where does man come from? Sexual intercourse is always infected, even in matrimony, with the desire of the flesh, with the heat of lust and the foul stench of wantonness. Because of this, the union of the sexes itself is contaminated. Whence too does the soul inherit, talk about free will, inherit the infection of sin, the corruption of evil, the filth of iniquity. Any liquid becomes corrupt if it is poured into a corrupt vessel. Who touches dirt himself becomes dirty. Let us now consider the food that nourishes the child in his mother's womb. Let us now consider the food that nourishes the child in his mother's womb. It is evident that the embryo is fed by the menstrual blood. This is why women stop menstruating after having conceived the child. This substance, menstrual blood, is said to be so detestable and impure that it makes trees barren and vineyards unproductive. It can kill grass, and if a dog eats out of it, rabies results. Should the menstrual blood infect the male seed, it may cause leprosy and elephantiasis in the child. Thus, the Mosaic law, therefore, considered women impure during the period of menstruation and punished by death those who had intercourse during that period. Oh, the vile ignobility of human existence. Oh, the ignoble condition of human vileness. Consider the grasses and the trees. Out of their substance, they produce flowers, leaves, and fruits. But man brings forth lice eggs, lice and stomach worms. They yield oil, wine, and balsam, whereas man spews forth sputum, urine, and excrement. They breathe forth a sweet odor, but man is redolent of an abominable stink. I will stop there, but it goes on and on and on, including an attack on those who claim to know anything. This is not your father's Presbyterianism. This is Christian religion in power from the voice of the Pope as official doctrine of the church. So the choice is not, oh, okay, you can live, they didn't kill you, and you could convert. It's the choice to go on in an existence of vile ignobility, detestable filth, and so forth, where you are constantly tortured by your own mind and by your own standards which you adopt. So on the grand scale, I say that both of them are infinitely, collectivism and religion are infinitely evil. And I mean that in the precise sense that I'm working on infinity in my book on the philosophy of mathematics. I've decided that infinity means a number big enough that it's off the scale. You can no longer measure increments. So if you think of your camera lens and it's set at infinity, that doesn't mean there aren't greater and greater distances. It means greater distances don't change the way the focus hits. It makes no difference that you've gone farther. When you got to this degree of evil and the communist and Nazi degree of evil, which is comparable, there are no degrees anymore. Where there are degrees is when you deal with attenuated versions of them, late stage versions of them, when they're tired and exhausted. But on the grand scale, it's not the case that either one of them is more evil than the other. The mystics of the mind and mystics of the spirit are two sides of the same evil coin. So, Andy, over to you.
Thank you for that cheerful presentation, Harry. So, I mean, you certainly established how evil Christianity was and is, and I don't dispute that for a second. It is catastrophically evil. Nevertheless, I disagree with an important point here, literally a life and death point, and that is that when they say where there's life, there's hope, and when you could survive under one system more readily than under the other system, that makes the one system less bad. Life is the standard of value, and one system is less murderous than the other. And there's got to be reasons for that, and there are. And I already, presented that. But but again, the point is where there's life, there's hope. This is why, and the individuality, that last shred of individuality, that this sickening philosophy that you just read about so, effectively, Harry. But that last shred of respect for the individual is what enables Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas not only to survive, but to triumph. They triumphed during the height of Christianity's power. It didn't happen under Hitler's regime. It didn't happen under Stalin's regime. Now, if Ayn Rand is right in Anthem, and I think she is, the collectivist dark age of the future would be even darker than the original dark age. And by the way, the ancient period was glorious in a way. The Greeks and the Romans reached some glorious achievements. Nevertheless, the dark age, the real dark age, dated roughly from the 5th to the 9th centuries AD, fell from a much lower bar than the collectivist world inherited from 19th and early 20th century Europe. 19th century Europe was a golden age. You have Hugo writing, and Rostand is writing, and Beethoven is composing during the 19th century, and Dostoevsky's writing Industrial Revolution. And the collectivists inherited a world that was vastly more advanced than what the Christians inherited. And Christianity is responsible for the Dark Age. I have no doubt about it. It's 100% responsible for the Dark Age. And collectivism is responsible for what I call the Red Ages, the oceans of blood that those bastards spilled. But there was no equivalent of the medieval Renaissance under the Nazis or communists. After 7, 8, 1,000, 100, 1,000 years, would there be? I don't know. That's speculation. If we're going to speculate, I tend to think that Ayn Rand is right, that the dark age, the collectivist dark age of the future, if there was an entirely collectivist world, there was no capitalism, no individualism anywhere, then I think the collectivist dark age would be even darker than the Christian dark age and falling from a much higher point. But the key point, I just want to keep repeating, I agree with you, Harry, about how evil Christianity is. I have no doubt of its evil. But I do think that last shred of respect for individuality and for free will is what enabled the medieval Renaissance to succeed, and that never happened under collectivism. And also, I'm going to write a book on the nature of evil. By the way, Harry, I disagree with you about something. What drove this essay was not so much contemporary politics, although I think that's important and related, but my original talk in 1995 at the Objectivist Summer Conference in San Francisco on villainy, the nature of evil, which is what I'm gonna, the book is going to be a full treatment of. And it's interesting to me that in 2,500 years of the history of moral philosophy since Socrates, there really hasn't been a lot written specifically on the nature of evil. And of course, Augustine, as you just pointed out, it's your gory reading of Christianity, Augustine would have a very different view on the nature of evil than Aristotle. But my view on the nature of evil, my theory of the nature of evil is going to come from 100% of objectivist standpoint. But so contemporary politics is part of it. And by the way, on contemporary politics, notice that there are Christian objectivists in our day. I don't know of any Marxist objectivists, but there are Christian objectivists. Now that's a contradiction. You can't be a Jew or Christian or Muslim or any religion and be an objectivist. For the belief in God's existence is entirely excluded by Ayn Rand's primacy of existence principle. So you can't logically consistently be both. So it's an arrant contradiction. But I think Christian objectivism is a beneficial. It's a positive, because I suspect in the overwhelming number of cases people are raised in Christianity and they found Ayn Rand when they were teenagers or later. So they're becoming less religious more secular, less faith-based, and more rational. So a Christian objectivist is not as good as a objectivist, but it's better than a Christian. And so it's making progress. But there's no Marxist objectivist. I mean, I know plenty of Marxists. I hate them. Christian objectivists, are reasonable people. Marxists are just evil, in my judgment. And there's a reason for that. There's no Marxist objectivist. For one, they're materialists. They don't even believe in the mind. But above all, they utterly reject individuality, which the Christians have some attenuated version of that's in common with objectivism. But I do think that ultimately, and here, I've read Leonard Peikoff's The Dim Hypothesis. I haven't studied it carefully, so I'm not an expert, and I don't want to put words in the mouth of Dr. Peikoff. Oh, by the way, I was overjoyed to see that he recovered fully from COVID, and that he went home and he's healthy and everything. Like Thomas Sowell, who's 90 and Leonard's 87. I hope they rock on for many years, of good health to come. Because in my judgment, Leonard Peikoff's the world's greatest living philosopher, and I've learned enormous amount from him. But if I understand him correctly, and I may be misinterpreting him. He thinks that religion is more dangerous than collectivism because it's more philosophical. It's misintegrated as opposed to disintegrated. Now I don't know if that's an accurate reading of Dr. Peikoff's theory here or not. So I just put it hypothetically. If that's the case, I disagree. I think collectivism is more dangerous than Christianity because it is vastly more philosophical and is vastly more integrated than Christianity is a bunch of nonsensical faith-based beliefs. It does have a philosophy, of metaphysics, epistemology, but it's all faith-based garbage. Collectivism has all of German philosophy behind it. Kant, Hegel, Marx, a complete philosophic system. Now, Kant and Hegel were Christians, of course, and Marx was a materialist, but that's not the main point. You have a complete, developed, reason-based, if I could call Kant, Hegel, Marx rational, but they're not faith-based. You have a complete philosophic system. I mean, metaphysically, you have the social primacy of consciousness, as Ayn Rand calls it. Epistemologically, truth is whatever the party says, and so we have to conform. What was that quote from Goering? I think it was a high-ranking Nazi functionary, that if the Führer says, I can't even say this with a straight face, if the Führer says 2 times 2 equals 5, then it is. So your truth is defined by whatever the party says, and we have to conform. And I think the most salient point here, in real time, what's really influenced human life in real time, is their theory on the metaphysical nature of man. And Harry, you put it before nicely, going all the way back to Plato, that human beings are this amorphous totality. There's a collectivist whole. An individual is nothing but like a cell, an appendage that's separated from the whole, and it's going to die. The individual is nothing. There's why I think, to quote William James, that has cash value. That really has an enormous impact in the real world under the communists and Nazis. Their ethics, of course, is Kantian. It's completely opposed to egoism. Dutiful service is the criterion of virtue, and the politics is completely Hegelian. The state with a capital S. I often thought if Hegel's typewriter had no uppercase letters, his whole political philosophy would have collapsed. Is that the state is a little mini God on earth. What does Hegel say in the Philosophy of Right? That individuals have no rights; they have only obligations. I had a professor in graduate school who used to say that if you really want to understand the philosopher, you got to know who his enemies are. Not only what he's for, but who and what he's against, which I think is overly polemical, but still, I think there's some truth to that. Hegel clearly arguing against the Lockean, Jeffersonian, Anglo-American theory of individual rights. And individual, again, this to me is the most important philosophical point. The individual is nothing under these bastards. Where the Christians is like, the individual is not much, but it's a little bit. And you can, all right, well, listen now, Bernus Magnus, although we ain't burn you at the stake, buddy, but we'll listen. I mean, he had a chance to triumph. He and Thomas Aquinas and other Catholic heroes, and they did. This is important. life's the standard of value. The Christians are less murderous. That is important. I do not want to sound like I'm going to defend Christianity. I am a devout atheist. I loathe religion. I think Christianity is less bad than Islam, but that's really damning them with faint praise. I don't want to defend Christianity. To say that it's less bad than Nazis or communists it's like my medical analogy, Harry, is more terminal cancer versus Ebola.
Versus
Ebola? Yeah, terminal cancer versus Ebola. Like terminal cancer might kill me in a matter of months, and Ebola might kill me in a matter of days. And you say, what's the difference? Well, there's a big difference, because if I have a matter of months, there's values that I could still achieve. I could get my affairs in order. If I have a child, I can make sure my will is made out, and so that my son or daughter gets the whatever wealth that I have. I could say goodbye to the persons that I love. There's still some chance of values in those last few months before I lapse into unconsciousness and die. It was Ebola. It might kill me eat out my bodily organs in a couple of days. So I do think in the grand scheme of things, the millimeters of 1 millimeter of evil less than the other bad. There's the worst and the worst. Can be not only a life and death difference. I wouldn't deride life, although your description of the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages is spot on. I have no disagreement with that, but I wouldn't deride a system that enables me to go on living as against one that's going to murder me, and maybe my whole family, which the collectivists will do. I wouldn't deride that, because life itself is a value. I could be with my wife or my husband or my children. It could still be values as opposed to death. But also there's the chance not just of survival. There's the chance of success. There's the chance of triumph. There's no getting away from the fact that the medieval Renaissance is real. Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas are real. It didn't happen under the collectivists. And the key to me, the key point is individualism versus collectivism. That, I think, is the salient point in this context. And I'll stop and let you talk, Harry, but I do want to talk about the war on the mind, why I think the collectivists are a more virulent war on the mind than the Christians are, as bad as the Christians are with their faith-based orthodoxy and burn you at the stake for heresy. So I'll stop here.
All right. Well, I'm going to just respond to a lot of the individual points. You said there are Christian, scare quote, objectivists, Christians who think they're objectivists, but there are no Marxist objectivists. Yeah, but there are Nazi objectivists. I remember a friend of mine, now deceased, who went to the NBI lectures in Washington, and there were 2 Nazis, neo-Nazis, who came to the NBI lectures in the 60s. So I don't think that point works for you. And then the big point that the Renaissance came, but nothing comes under communism. It's just the opposite. In just 70 years, we have perestroika and glasnost. You remember those? Which came from within the system by the dictator Gorbachev. And that led to almost the immediate downfall of Russia. Marxism contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. Christianity does not, Nazism doesn't. It contains within it the seeds of its own destruction, and here I play upon Marx's own language, because it promises abundance on earth. Marxism is a philosophy that claims to be scientific and predicts that under communism, you will be wealthy, you'll be rich. Whereas under capitalism, you'll be starved and poor. And after 70 years of them saying, well, not yet, but in 5 years, we'll pass the West. That is what led to the downfall of belief in the ideology. And it wasn't just Gorbachev. The critical point in the fall of the Soviet Union in its domination over Eastern Europe came when the order was given by, I think, Gorbachev, to send the tanks into the Baltic countries who were in revolt, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The tanks were, the generals had the tanks lined up on the border, and they were going to do to those countries what they had done to Hungary in 57 and Poland in 69. And the generals refused to carry out the orders. And very instructive was the difference between Tiananmen Square and that. In Tiananmen Square, the communists still had some allegiance from their followers, and they were able to put down the rebellion and not lead to a wider rebellion. In 1989, 1990, the only people who believed in Marxism were those outside the Soviet bloc, mainly in American and Canadian universities. That's where the strongholds of Marxism were. No one believed it anymore. If you read Ayn Rand's To Dream the Non-Commercial Dream, she talks about Khrushchev visiting the US and reciting the stale platitudes of Marxism that she had learned as a child in Russia, as a kind of catechism. And she said, and he believed it. He was saying it like a magic incantation, and he believed it. Well, no one believed it after a while, because it was, Marxism is based upon a series of predictions that can be easily falsified, and were and have been. And that's why I don't think China is going to last in the clamping down again with communism, because it's supposed to deliver the goods, and it does not, and it cannot. So that's my first 2 points. The other one is the standard is life, but it's not a mere physical survival. It's the standard is man's life qua man, and you cannot live that in the Dark Ages. You cannot live that under Christianity. Anthem. I'm kind of getting back to the Gorbachev and Perestroika thing again. Anthem fell. Equality 7 whatever was able to get out, was able to build a life for himself and to send back into the city to get people to join him. I mean, that was his plans. It's not actually showed, of course, in the novel. So it's a collectivist society that lasts clearly for several centuries, as implied in the novel. But it falls when an individual chooses to use his mind. So it's not true that communism has some sort of iron grip, or Nazism has some sort of iron grip that can't be overthrown either from the outside or from within. They're very vulnerable. It's religion that's very hard to overthrow, because it says you will suffer. And then it makes that prediction come true. So it is much harder to overthrow and get out of and think your way out of religion, which says it's a sin to question, than under communism, which says we have all this doctrine of Marx. Das Kapital is 3 volumes, and you study it and you become savvy in it, and you will see that we are right. Finally, the anti-mind, well, it's not finally. The anti-mind of religion is the anti-self of collectivism. And where did Marxism come from? From Christianity. So collectivism is simply the secularized version of the Sermon on the Mount. It is the same thing as Christianity, and it's not true that one is worse than the other on the grand scale. And Ebola versus cancer, I agree with you. Just have the same example I do. There's immediate death versus a delayed death with a chance of fighting back or whatever. You want the delayed death. And that's what I say is the concrete here and now kind of issue that shouldn't be mixed in. It may well be, and it is true that sometimes it's rational to ally with the left against the right, and sometimes it's rational, I'm talking about in a vote. Sometimes it's rational to vote with the right against the left. So for instance, Ayn Rand did both. She voted for Moynihan to stop Buckley in the Conservative Party in New York. and she voted with Nixon to stop McGovern on the left. So those decisions are hard and they're arguable. They're not deducible from, well, Christianity gives some kind of credence to the individual soul. You can't get from there to, I should vote for Trump over Biden or Biden over Trump, either one. Now, if you're going to change, and I don't mean like you're changing it dishonestly, but if you're going to broaden up your thesis to Kantianism, a whole philosophy, Hegelianism, is vastly more evil than religious conservatives. Again, you're mixing two levels, but you're right then. The real evil, the source of all the evil in the modern world is Kant. And Hegel is just Kant without the noumenal world. Every historian of philosophy says that. Probably Hegel said it himself. So if you want to fight Kant and Hegel and say that they are, and I don't mean them as people, obviously, Kantianism and Hegelianism are the things that are our main enemy and the enemy of everything living and individual and rational, yes, sign me up for that. But I don't get, since both sides today, Democrat and Republican, are Kantian Hegelian, and the question is, well, to what extent and how consistently and how urgently is one worse than the other have to be defeated. You don't have the thesis that you started out with, but you have a correct thesis then. Yes, the enemy is Kantianism, Hegelianism, pragmatism. Philosophy from Kant on is what has to be thought. Now, I'm going to give you, of course, you're entitled to, I'm not giving you a chance to respond, but I also want to adumbrate another subject entirely that comes out of this. What about the positives? What do we look to when we want to achieve something with people who are either religious conservatives or leftists? Can you gain anything from trying to persuade your garden variety Bernie Sanders fan or your garden variety Ted Cruz fan or Donald Trump fan? I think you can in some cases. I don't think that they're all the same. And I would like to discuss what can you call upon to make progress with the better people in both camps. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. I want to go to some of these points, including Gorbachev, Glasnost, Perestroika. I think the reason why a lot of people in the Soviet Union were disgusted with communism is because there was still a capitalist world, and they knew about it. You had the Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America beaming behind the Iron Curtain. There were still all kinds of bootlegs smuggled in from the West, clothes and magazines and books, and people knew that there was a free society and there was a free world somewhere. And I think that contributed enormously to the collapse of communism in Eastern and Central Europe. Now, the collectivist dictatorship Ayn Rand depicts in Anthem is a worldwide collectivist state where there's no free country anywhere. And I think that's why she thinks, and I think she's right, that an entirely collectivist world would sink to lower depths than the first Dark Age, and from a much greater height than the first Dark Age descended from. So I don't think the communists get any credit for that. I think that's the contribution of Western civilization, and I don't think it would happen in a fully communist world. We'll see how long North Korea goes on. Now, as a devout atheist, I pray to God, the gods of reason, let's say, to the gods of reason, that communism falls in North Korea, because I don't want to see innocent human beings brutalized by this kind of system. And North Korea, of course, had an enormous amount of intelligence. All countries do, all peoples do, but we see it in the United States with Korean immigrants, and the real capitalism versus communism contrast, of which there are many, is all these Korean kids in the United States going to UCLA or Stanford or Berkeley, getting PhDs in electrical engineering, and North Korea has no electricity. But there's an enormous amount of intelligence in North Korea, obviously, but it's a hermit kingdom. How much information from the West is getting in there? I don't think there's very much. And so I'm afraid that without that inspiration from the West and the knowledge about what life in a free society is like, I don't know that communism may go on in North Korea for a long time to come. It's like a little mini version of Anthem. It's like it's a little mini collectivized world that's cut off from the rest of the world. So that's one point I wanted to make. I was appalled to hear that there were Nazi objectivists, Harry, but I don't know of any. You cited two examples. I don't know of any Nazi objectivist movement, whereas there is a sort of Christian objectivist movement. It's kind of a thing, where there are any number. And I knew a bunch of Jewish objectivists who brought me in to speak at Baruch College in New York City. It's kind of a thing. And notice the left, they didn't mention Ayn Rand except to smear her. Paul Krug, New York Times, recent example. Whereas the religious conservatives are mixed. Now, William Buckley may burn in hell, as far as I'm concerned. He never mentioned Ayn Rand. He could have might as well have been a leftist. In that sense, he never mentioned Ayn Rand except to excoriate her, and allowed that disgraceful Whittaker Chambers review of Atlas Shrugged to be published. Was Big Sister is watching every page in Atlas Shrugged, screaming, was it to a gas chamber go or to a concentration camp go? Now, these guys are literate. Whittaker Chambers was a literate individual. William Buckley's a very highly intelligent. This is just dishonest. So, the conservatives are sometimes in the way they treat Ayn Rand are just as bad as the New York Times or the Washington Post or the left. But on the other hand, there are leading conservatives, religious conservatives, who have a much more positive take on Ayn Rand. Now, I don't agree with Rush Limbaugh on a lot of issues, but I think he's a very good polemicist against the left, and he quote from Ayn Rand in positive ways. And correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't really keep tabs on the religious conservatives that much, but I think Mark Levin at times, who's very intellectual, and I think Sean Hannity at times also, quote positively from Ayn Rand. And there's a reason. There's reasons for this, as there have to be. And again, there's a last shred of respect for individuality in the Christians that enabled the grand scale achievements of the medieval Renaissance and in our day. Open some of these thinkers open to Ayn Rand in a positive way. And I think Christianity is less evil than collectivism because of its shred of respect for individuality. And also, amongst the religious conservatives, it's an interesting mixture. The left is becoming just less and less American. I don't know. Are they even like the Democratic Party? Is it even an American party anymore? It's a German party. It's dominated by German philosophies, specifically Hegel and Marx. And moving more and trending more and more in that direction. Bernie Sanders is the spirit of the Democratic Party. AOC was dubbed the future of the Democratic Party by Tom Perez, chair of the DNC. They're moving in that direction. There's almost no Americanism, 18th century Enlightenment individualism left in the Democratic Party. Whereas in the Republicans and the religious conservatives, they're just a hodgepodge farrago of elements. There's all this Christianity, which is bad. And then there's their elements of leftist Marxism, the Me Too, welfare state, this type, which is bad. And then sometimes there's a last element of Americanism there. There's a last, shred of respect for the American founders. Once in a while, they even mention individual rights. Even Trump, as mixed as he was, had instituted the 1776 initiative against that insane 1619 project of the New York Times to celebrate America's founding. There's a last element of Americanism in the Republicans and amongst the religious conservatives that the leftists in the Democratic Party have simply abandoned. I've said many times, I'll say it again, the Democratic Party of Harry Truman, John Kennedy, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Henry Scoop Jackson, that party's dead. It's the party of Bernie Sanders now. They're moving towards communism. where there's still a little bit of respect for the individual. And here's is the difference. And it does, my essay isn't focused on contemporary politics, although it mentions it, but there is this integration here, that individuality is what ties together Christians in their distilled essence in the 13th century and in a very attenuated form in the 21st century. But there's that respect for the individual soul that makes them better than makes them less bad than
Andy,
the real thing.
Being an hour in, I think it's appropriate that we have more back and forth. So I'd like to jump in, and then you can jump in on me if that's okay with you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right. We each spoke at length enough. I have written that the contemporary average Democrat, is worse, farther from us, the average one, than the average conservative Republican. I think that, for one thing, they're more dangerous because they control the media, the universities, the entertainment sphere. And now we find tech companies are all in the pockets of the progressive, which means the regressive wing of the Democratic Party. So I do think that at this point in history, the Democrats pose the more urgent threat. Mm-hmm. And I see that, but I do not agree, if you're saying this, that the conservative Republicans retain any shred of Americanism. I haven't seen one speck of it. What I see is nationalism, which is anti-Americanism. They never reference John Locke. They never appeal to individual rights in the way that we do. They talk about, occasionally the word rights appears, but they have no concept of, look, I have a right to my land. I have a right, to guns. That's the most questionable extension of rights, which is to guns. And I have become converted to the Second Amendment, so to speak, but It's not a big issue. But I don't see,
issue, Harry.
I see, no, it isn't. I see a fear of foreigners, an anti-immigration, a desire to blame China for everything, and a very ugly kind of nationalism that wasn't there 20 years ago.
No, I agree with you about that. First of all, if some bad guy breaks into my house in the middle of the night and I have to defend myself or my daughter with a shotgun or a steak knife, it's a Second Amendment right, life and death issue. Especially if they're going to defund the police, Harry, and the cops won't come for.
A cop talked me out of that at the gun store. I was in a gun store to buy a shotgun for just that reason, because I'm here on the ground floor, with not that much protection. New York City is very safe, but out in New York City, you take your life in your hands. So I was there, and the ex-cop said to me, if you shoot the guy, you better be sure to kill him. And I said, why? And he said, because he'll sue you. You'll be in court for 5 years and he'll win.
Yeah, Harry, I understand. That's
so true, I decided not to get a gun. I decided to run.
I get it. But that's a product of an insanely litigious society siding with bad guys against the innocent.
It's a leftist thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's a leftist thing. In the real world where we live, having a gun makes me better able to defend myself at home. If my daughter's here, if my girlfriend is here, then just having to defend myself, with a steak knife. But anyhow, going back to the Republicans, you're absolutely right. They become more and more nationalistic, which is a form of collectivism. And in its distilled form, it leads to jingoistic mania and endless warfare. World War I is one example. And when it combines with socialism, it's National Socialism. So it's a form of collectivism that's horrible. And I have tremendous regrets to see in the American conservatives move in that direction. Nevertheless, there's still some freedom lovers. I like Kristi Noem, governor of South Dakota. I think is maybe the most liberty-loving politician in the country today. I have hopes that she might develop into a 21st century American version of Margaret Thatcher, who, in my judgment, is the best head of state of my lifetime. Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina and U.S. ambassador to the United States, United Nations. She also, I think, has a certain respect for individual rights. There are some people amongst the Republicans and the religious conservatives who are better. And even, I'm going to get, I don't want to be completely dead against the Democrats. What's her name from Hawaii? Tulsi Gabbard is much less bad than anybody else. And maybe Joe Manchin from West Virginia.
Yeah.
Yeah, Joe Manchin from West Virginia, Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard should just switch parties at this point. She should just become a Republican. She has some degree of sanity. She speaks out against these insane policies of the left, like I can be any gender I want to be. And if I identify as female, I can go compete in women's sports. I'm 6 foot, play basketball against women who are 5'4", and these women who train all their lives and they're great athletes and they're so dedicated and they're so great at what they do. And now they have to compete against somebody who's 8 inches taller and, 70 pounds heavier, longer arms, longer legs, longer stride and everything. It's just so unfair, and it's just based in primacy of consciousness, insanity. So the Democrats are almost insane, with a few exceptions like Tulsi Gabbard and Joe Manchin. There's still some better Republicans. I get your point about nationalism; it's bad. They're moving into the conservatives are moving into collectivism, and that's, since I think collectivism is worse than religion, that's not a direction I want to see the Republicans moving.
Well, I'm arguing that religion is collectivist, it's tribal, and that there's no. I make the distinctions you make, not always in agreement with you, in practical politics, but I don't try to deduce it from the grand scale historical picture, which I think is a great picture to get into. But I just don't think you can, go from that to the next election. But let's talk about the positives. There are better Democrats and there are better Republicans or religious conservatives. And what can you call upon to move them in a better direction?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know what these people are going to do. I do think, for the reasons I gave, I think the Republicans are less bad than the Democrats. To me, it makes sense that Joe Manchin from West Virginia or Tulsi Gabbard from Hawaii would, if they want to continue their career in politics, would switch to the Republican Party. I think the Republicans are more open or less closed off. Let's put it that way, because I don't want to give them too much credit. Less closed off to Ayn Rand and objectivism than the Democrats are. Paul Ryan, for example, was claimed that he was influenced by Atlas Shrugged, and he was very religious, but he claimed some influence from Atlas Shrugged. I can't remember the last time I heard a Democrat mention Ayn Rand or any leftist mention Ayn Rand in any positive sense.
No. But of course, Paul Ryan threw her under the bus when he got the nomination for Veep.
Yeah, they have no integrity. He may well have been influenced by Ayn Rand, but he didn't think it would sell in the marketplace of the polls.
Yeah.
So
but I think you can appeal in the Republican case, you can appeal to the religious people's desire for morality and build upon their desire for moral principles and convince them that moral principles can be grounded in reason. They don't have to be based on authority. And I don't know how far you can get in attacking and stating the truth with them, stating the truth that God is the enemy of morality. But you can at least say, yes, moral principles are essential. Without them, we're animals. And it's important to defend them with good, rational arguments. And I think they would tend to agree with that. I haven't tried that. I bet Betsy has, because she's always looking for that kind of way in. And with the Democrats, I would try, you respect reason and science, and there can be reason and science applied to morality.
Yeah, but Harry, they don't respect science. They respect.
Yeah, and the conservatives don't respect morality either, but they think they do. They think both sides think they do.
No, I think we'd have better success with the religious conservatives appealing to the individual and the rights of the individual because once we get into science with the leftists, we have to discuss global warming and shutting down the economy. That's what they mean by science. And the global warming, the climate change is complete pseudoscience. The science is all in this.
It's religion.
And I'm not sure about shutting down the economy. And the little I know about it, shutting down, making people stay at home. I don't think that had any effect on the coronavirus. Sweden didn't shut down that way, didn't do the lockdown, and for example, and didn't do any worse than many other places in Europe. In fact, there were other countries in Europe that locked down severely that did worse than Sweden. So their idea of science is generally pseudoscience. I don't know that we're going to get anywhere.
It is, and the morality is pseudo-morality, but you can still
but the individual matters. Individual matters to a lot of Christians, and the rights of the individual matter.
Gee, I haven't seen that at all. But I'd like to
property rights. Now, the one area where the Christians are really bad regarding individual rights is abortion. They're fervently opposed to a woman's right to abortion, even in the first trimester, when there's no rational case you can make that the fetus is a human being. So, we're not going to convince them of individual rights across the board, but on a lot of other issues, they're much better than Democrats. Property rights, they tend to be less bad. The right to own a gun, which I do think for honest persons can be a life and death issue, especially if these lunatics on the left are going to defund the police. And there's a number of issues like that where I think we can appeal to the religious conservatives about individuals, and they want there's that Americanism there that they want prosperity. They don't want to lower the living standards. They don't want to.
Well, that's true. That's a good point, Andy. That the right wants success and the left wants failure.
Yeah, and poverty.
They talk in broad terms.
They're gonna shut down the use of fossil fuels for no offsetting gain, since climate change is natural in the first place. They're gonna shut down the use of fossil fuels, and they're gonna lead us to much. I don't want to exaggerate, say destitution, although it may be that, but they're gonna lead us to much lower living standards than we have. Whereas with the conservatives, we can appeal to prosperity. They tend to be Americans. The leftists, they're not Americans anymore. They're freaking Germans. I hate them. And not that I want to knock Germany. Germany's had a great culture, but not in philosophy. German philosophy has been horrendous, and it's taken over the American universities and the American, the Democratic Party. Like you said, the leftists, meaning German philosophy, controls the universities, the education system, the Hollywood controls the news media, it controls big tech, and now controls the government, and they're dead wrong, and they're much worse than the conservatives. Even Trump is less bad, I think, than those guys.
No, nobody's as bad as Trump.
I don't want to argue with you.
That's the axiom.
I don't want to argue with you about Trump, but some of the Republicans, I think Kristi Noem and Nikki Haley, who I mentioned, are more liberty-loving than others in the Republican Party, and much more so than the Democrats.
Okay, so how did we come down on my main? I shouldn't call it what I was going to call. How do we come down on the point that I was stressing, that you can't go from the body count over the ages to how to vote in the next election?
Well, I stated, I think that's true, but there's a whole development there. What I want to do, and I don't think I may not have made it clear enough in the essay, but what I certainly want to do in the book on the nature of evil is not I may not even discuss contemporary politics. I want to show what evil is from an objective standpoint, so that we can better protect ourselves from it. And then in that context, if there's one iteration of it that's more virulent than the other iterations, then I think it's important to identify that, that the if I'm right that the collectivists are slightly more evil than the Christians, then that's an important form of intellectual self-defense. We know who the most egregious danger is.
Well, yeah, I ask you to distinguish today's leftists, Bernie Sanders and that type, versus today's religious conservatives. And I don't know if you should take Ted Cruz, because then you're going to be in trouble trying to defend that. But some more centrist religion, DeSantis, our governor, who seems to have been a very good governor and is, I'm told, a religious conservative.
Right.
Let's distinguish that from the doctrine. The doctrine of "you are mud, why do you boast?" is exactly as bad as "you are a cog in the machine, you are a cell on. Losing you is no cost." So I don't see any difference there. That's death by fire or death by hanging.
Harry, I get your point, but again, I think it's too theoretical. I think we need to bring it down to, to the real world and real time. And I think there is that difference that the Christians were less murderous. And at the height of their powers, they were unbelievably murderous, but the collectivists were even worse for the reasons that I gave. And I think to me, it is a distinction between terminal cancer and Ebola. And that's not much of a distinction there. But there is a distinction there that will enable me to achieve some values that the other one will not.
I feel like I'm not making much headway. Maybe we should take questions.
I was actually going to say we have quite a few questions. We have questions in the Zoom chat that I can already say I don't think we're going to get to. We have some raised hands in Zoom, which I'm hoping we're going to get to. But we're going to start with super chat questions and comments. And we're going to start with Michael Sanders, because he has quite a few comments and questions and has backed them up with, I think, $155 of super chats. So thank you for that, Michael. And his first comment is, low IQ, uneducated people, particularly prison inmates, have benefited from embracing Christianity over hedonism and nihilism. I don't know of anyone whose life and values have improved from embracing Marxism and Nazism. His second comment, I've never met anyone who called themselves a Nazi objectivist. No one in the alt-right identifies with objectivism. I have met many people who identify as Christian objectivists. They see the value in objectivism, but haven't developed the courage to throw out their Christianity. And now Michael's first question is, Yaron said, the Nazis were much more suicidal than the communists. Do you agree with this statement? If so, why do you believe that that was the case?
Let me answer this quickly. First of all, I don't know about low IQ people in prisons benefiting from Christianity. That may be true. But what I agree with in that comment is nihilism. And thank you for bringing that up, Michael. Nihilism. I've heard it pronounced in different ways. I think the Nazis and the communists are, and you can see it in the left today. They're nihilists. They want to burn down American cities. They are destruction for its own sake, much more so than the Christians are, and that's why I think one reason why Christians want to glorify God, and it's horrendously irrational, but they're not destruction for its own sake, not the way the Nazis and communists are. The question was about Christian objectivists, Fuzzy?
Am I muted?
No, I can hear you.
All right. The question was,
You said it. Yeah.
Do you agree with the statement that the Nazis were much more suicidal than the communists? And why do you believe that was the case, if so?
It's an interesting question. During the war, when the Nazis needed the training, the Soviets are invading from the east, the Western allies are coming, from the west. The Nazis needed the trains to move troops and supplies and everything, and yet they used them to send Jews to the concentration camp. They're like Jim Taggart and Atlas Shrugged. They were more they were happy. Maybe happy is not the right word. They were more willing to murder the Jews, even though they knew their own demise would be hastened, then they were concerned with defending themselves against their enemies. And so that is certainly suicidal. I don't know that the communists were quite that insane. So that claim may well be true.
Can I speak to that? I can,
Go ahead, Harry.
Marxism is a 19th century phenomenon. Nazism is a 20th century phenomenon. And I think that's what accounts for it. The communists thought they were being scientific and their goal was material. They wanted people to get wealthy. They criticized Christianity for promising pie in the sky. They wanted pie on the earth. And they were pro-pie. So the Nazis didn't have that. They came in at a later period where things had gotten worse, and they were organized around the will to power and sacrifice and suffering. So I think that's why they were much more suicidal. I think suicide was what they were really after. The communists secretly were for death, but claimed and had their propaganda being for life on this earth was their goal. And the one before that, no, I don't think anybody is ever made better off by Christianity, for the simple reason that no one is ever made better off by lying to themselves or believing fairy tales as if they were true.
Yeah, Marx claims to be scientific socialism. I agree with you, Harry, and it's the claim to rationality in Hegel that the communists embrace. Whereas you're right, the Nazis come later, and they're more influenced by German irrationalism, the overt irrationalism, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, people like that, and they openly embrace emotionalism. Is our feelings, we feel our superiority in our blood and our bowels. They eschewed rationality explicitly. They rejected logic as a Jewish tool. And of course, the Marxists reject logic as a bourgeois tool. But you're right. The Marxists scientific socialism tries to embrace the Hegelian claim to reason, whereas the Nazis embraced German irrationalists. They overtly rejected reason. So they more suicide.
So we have 3 more questions from Michael before we go on to other super chats and other questions. As the right becomes more nationalistic and the left becomes more socialistic, will the two eventually merge into national socialism, where Christianity plays a supporting role but not the primary thrust? Dr. Binswanger, do you want to start on
they will merge into something, whether it's nationalistic socialism or collectivistic environmentalism, with the identification of Gaia, the spirit of the world, with God. There's so little difference between the two factions that I'm afraid they'll eventually merge, and then there'll be no way out.
That is a terrifying prospect, and it's impossible to predict the future. Well, it's enormously difficult because people have free will, but that's very possible. That if the conservatives keep moving towards nationalism and the leftists keep moving deeper and deeper into socialism, even though they hate each other, it's not impossible that some, like a can happen here figure can arise to unite the nationalism with the social. Right now, the nationalists claim to be opposed to socialism, like Trump, and the socialists claim to be opposed to nationalism, like Bernie Sanders. But it's not impossible, 20 years down the road, some figure might arise, some real charismatic Hitler kind of figure might arise who can combine the two into National Socialism, and that is absolutely terrifying.
Bernie Sanders is pro-tariff, by the way, and against imports, and he's not big on immigration. So he's already paving the way here, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Michael's next question is for Harry. Do you think that the dim hypothesis is coming true before our eyes, or are there flaws in it that you see?
I don't have an opinion on that. I agree with the conclusion that religion is the bigger threat over the long term compared to nihilism, because religion gives people answers. And people can only put up with things like the looting that we saw this summer and defund the police and all that kind of stuff for a certain amount of time. They need a system, they need a philosophy, and nihilism doesn't have one. So I think the long-term threat, and here by long-term, I would say 50 years is the minimum unit. Religion is the bigger threat for victory.
See, I disagree. I think Dr. Peikoff is certainly right that we're moving towards dictatorship, but I think we're moving towards a secular Marxist version of dictatorship rather than a religious dictatorship. And about the nihilists or the nihilists, I keep thinking about Nazi Germany and the role in our day that Marxist terrorist organizations like Antifa and Black Lives Matter play, because what the Nazis did in the like 1920s, early 1930s, Hitler had his stormtroopers, the SA, his brown shirts, and they had endless street riots fighting against communists and union organizers, and part of that goal of the endless violence is to bring down the freer country, to bring down the capitalist system, to bring down the democratically elected government, bring down the Weimar government, and in our case, to bring capitalism to its knees. The Saul Alinsky playbook here: create crises, never let a crisis go to waste. Endless riots, burnings, street fighting, killings. The goal is to bring the capitalist system to its knees. It's to cause destruction. And of course, the Nazis succeeded in taking control, not of some third world backwards country, but one of the most advanced countries in the world. They gained power in Germany. I mean, the communists came to power in Russia, which was an agrarian society, generally backwards, similarly for Mao in China. But Germany's one of the most advanced culture, heavily industrialized, scientific genius, literary, musical genius, and genius in every field. The Nazis took over Germany. And it can happen here. Sinclair Lewis is right about that. And I think the danger comes from the nihilistic left and the endless destruction and the violence in the streets, and defund the police to foment crime. You're causing crises, endless crises. And what's the answer to that? Strong authoritarian government. And you're going to lead to a secular Marxist dictatorship. To me, that's where the danger comes.
Oh, they could lead to the right-wing authoritarian to combat the lawlessness and nihilism of the left.
Yeah, it could be some old George Wallace type. But
yeah, you want to hear something positive, optimistic?
Yes. Go on.
It's possible. It occurred to me the other day following GameStop and the flash mobs attacking the hedge funds, which is pure nihilism. But people are talking about this is a sea change, and no longer can the authorities be in command. Maybe it's a time that the universities lost their stranglehold on the mind. Maybe people start questioning all the dogmas of philosophy that they are taught, and the objectivism will have a chance to be the flash mob of the future.
So that would be great, and I do want to get into some optimistic points, because I don't tend naturally to be pessimistic. But one more pessimistic point, and that is the racism of the left, their overt anti-white racism, and then the covert racism of the welfare state that has warred on the black family and led to 70% illegitimacy rates and catastrophic crime rates. But I think they know that the endless racism is going to give rise to Richard Spencer and the so-called alt-right. And I think that if that continues over the next 10 or 20 years, I think you're going to see, right now, the alt-right, the neo-Nazi mentality, they're a very marginalized portion of 234 million white Americans. But if you have endless attacks on white people, they're going to grow. And I don't think the left fears that. Because I think they welcome it for the same reason that Hitler wanted endless street violence to bring down the regime. I think they welcome, Charlottesville 2018, those kind of riots all across the country. Those crises will help bring down American capitalism, and then the Nazis and the communists can fight over who takes power. I think the left welcomes that, and unfortunately,
Yep.
it could happen.
Yeah, Dr. Binswanger, did you want to add something?
No, I agree that the left is presumably the hard left is overjoyed at right-wing violence. They've been talking about it for so long. We never saw it until January 6th, and then we saw it. And I do want to add that in response to the January 6th storming of the Capitol, the correct way to view it is not, well, why are these guys getting shafted when the left riots of the summer were all apologized for and nothing happened to them? The correct way to look at it is these guys who stormed the Capitol should have the book thrown at them, and so should the rioters on the left who did the equivalent on the state level, attacking police stations and courthouses. And they are the same thing. They didn't do it to the national Capitol, but they did it to the authorities that were local, and they should be prosecuted. So, it's like, don't say, well, they got away with it, so the right should get away with it. Say both, the left should be punished the way the right is being punished. If you want to use the terms left and right, I'm not sure those are the right terms.
No, I agree. But again, I think Charlottesville and the riots between, the Klan and the Nazis on the one hand, and Antifa and Black Lives Matter on the other, I think the left welcomes that. Again, the purpose is to bring America to its knees, to bring the capitalist system to its knees, to be able to establish an authoritarian state, to crush the endless violence, and they can fight it out amongst themselves, whether that authoritarianism is Nazi or communist.
And I think the fringe, neo-Nazis on the right, I hesitate to call it the right, on that side also are spoiling for a fight. And they both want to get out there and fight. And they both want it because they think it's satisfying emotionally to them. And it's the path to greater prominence and greater power.
Right. And Richard Spencer made clear, the head of one of the heads of the alt-right made clear he voted Democrat. And which is interesting, why he would want the Democrats in power. And I think the reason is the more power the Democrats have, the more the anti-white racism will, enable him to reach out to more of his white brothers.
What do you think of the positive chance, though, that the university stranglehold on the intellect will be broken by the internet?
Well, they say from your lips to God's ears, Harry. The universities in the humanities programs, with some exceptions, are a cesspool of poison. I think, I'm writing a book on education, and I think we need to start, much younger than that. Rudolph Flesch's book, Why Johnny Can't Read, was a brilliant book in support of phonics and against any version of the disastrous whole word method or any other. So, my book is Why Johnny Still Can't Read or Write, Spell, or Understand Math, and what we could do about it. And I think, we need more and more homeschooling. And if parents don't have the time to do that, more and more they can hire tutors. The internet makes that possible. If you make money, I tutor. A lot of people in this call may know Melanie Hoffman in Minnesota. I tutor her kids, online, and other objectivist intellectuals tutor her kids. The internet makes that possible. You work and make money, and you can have your kids tutored by real experts, people who have degrees in their subject, in history, not in education, but degrees in history or mathematics or philosophy or whatever it is. And you don't get that way. You could pick and choose. You don't get the Marxist propaganda. But also, parents seem to think that I drop little Johnny and Judy off at the school in the morning and I go to work and the schools educate these kids. They need to be educated. That the schools aren't educated. They're indoctrinated. There's very little education. There's a great deal of indoctrination. So my book is pitched to the parents, just like Rudolf Flesch's book in 1955 was pitched to the parents to try and, get the parents to realize homeschool these kids, hire tutors for the kids, get them out of the system. And the same thing with college. So there is hope here.
Michael's last question, and we have a few more super chat questions after that, but the last one from Michael was, how is Kant responsible for racism, communism, and egalitarianism?
How is Kant responsible for racism, egalitarianism, and socialism? Was it?
Yeah, communism.
Well, Kant lays the foundation. I mean, the direct link is through Hegel, because Kant politically is a Republican. He supports the Republic in the United States and in France. He wasn't a collectivist, but he's an extreme altruist. So which is one way where he has influence, and also his metaphysics and epistemology. He subjectivizes cognition. There's no objective world anymore, or at least not knowable. And like Harry said before, Hegel rejects the noumenal world, and if Kant says it's unknowable, how does he know it exists? But Kant, first of all, Kant subjectivizes cognition and knowledge. Hegel socializes it. It depends upon. Hegel takes Kant's categories and says each society, each culture, organizes its experience in the same way. And so as Leonid Peikoff says, it's Hegelian development out of Kant. The social primacy of consciousness mentality emerges, and from that comes the claims every race has its own worldview, and we're clashing. The working class, every economic class has its own worldview, and we're necessarily clashing. Each gender has its own worldview, and there's no dictionary translation. We're necessarily clashing. That you get from that the Marxist division of human society into warring groups, whether they're races, economic classes, genders, sexual orientation, whatever it is. Now, racism's been around for a long time. We can't pin that on Kant and Hegel. That's been around for a long time, and in societies all over the world that never read Kant and Hegel. But certainly in the West, Kant and Hegel exacerbate enormously the racism. Leads to the racism of National Socialism. Leads to the economic class warfare of Marx and the communists. So. And of course, the altruism of Kant, that all virtue is self-sacrificing. The Nazis and communists certainly took that over. You sacrifice for whether the working class or the race. You sacrifice for the state. So it's not just Kant. Kant lays the foundation, but you have to realize that Hegel was universally regarded as the most important philosopher of the 19th century for a reason. Enormously important, especially in his collectivist politics. But also that social primacy of consciousness metaphysics that he builds out of Kant, subjectivizing, all knowledge. What's the leitmotif of like contemporary culture? I mean, part of it is you belong to this group, whether it's racial, economic, gender-based, or whatever, and the group has its own worldview, has its own categories, to use Kantian terms. You're steeped in it, you're raised in it, you're reared in it, you're educated in it. You see the world I see the world like a white man. I can't possibly understand, a non-white or a female perspective. So then, and this is postmodernism, and it's a direct development out of Kant, Hegel, and Marx. And then we have different worldviews, different Weltanschauung, to use the German term, and there's no dictionary translation. And so we can't possibly understand each other. And as the postmodernists say, hearkening back to the sophists in ancient Greece, force is the ultimate arbiter and of human disputes, and that's what you see, these warring classes, warring races, and by the way, this is the left, not so much the religious conservatives, and it's evil.
The introduction to the Critique of Pure Reason said, I found I had to deny reason to make room for faith. Kant saved Christianity and Christian ethics from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. He was the figure that ended the Enlightenment. He's treated as if he were an Enlightenment figure. He's the anti-Enlightenment figure. So if you contrast Thomas Aquinas and John Locke to Kant, you have, after Kant, a very powerful system with arguments that are hard to answer, that attempts to show your mind is not capable of knowing the real truth, but it can know the internal truth. That's the Booby Prize or the Consolation Prize. It can know the internal truth. Hegel comes along, and then the pragmatist in space says, yes, but there's not the same structuring of experience for all human beings. There's different, this is what Andy was saying, there's different structuring of the phenomenal world, the internal world, if you're of this race or that, or if you're of this class of that, or if you're of this gender or that. So starting with, we don't know things as they really are, we know our biased perspective on them from inside. You then have no way of saying, well, my biased perspective from the inside is rational and right, and you should agree with it. It's just, well, that's me, and I take refuge in a lot of other people like me. And that's where the collectivism comes in. So it natural, once you deny reason, which is the self is the mind, which is the rational faculty. Once you deny that, the self is gone, and you have to cling to some group or other for protection and for what you think is your advancement.
You know, what's interesting, Kant, of course, was a devout Puritan. So he's absolutely trying to save faith and Christianity. And yet, Christianity has waned in influence in the West slowly, since the Renaissance and continuing after Kant. And, statism has waxed. The state has become a little mini God on earth. And Kant's philosophy, unbeknownst to him, obviously, because he couldn't have known what would happen after his death, but Kant's philosophy has become part of the epistemological and moral foundation of collectivism, more than it saved Christianity. And the nihilism, as Leonard Peikoff has pointed out, in both the Omnibus Parallels and in Objectivism, Philosophy of Ayn Rand, the nihilism, once you attack the mind and reason, all that's going to follow is destruction. And that's what has followed in modern culture. You have, crucifixes, hanging in urinals, as a great work of art. The Christians don't do that. They want to glorify God, but the nihilists, they want to tear down anything, whether it's irrational.
Yes, but let's remember that glorifying God means condemning and spitting on man. That's how you glorify God. I am nothing, God. You are everything. I am a miserable sinner.
Harry, you're absolutely right. We read St. Augustine, we see that. And yet there's a whole nother strand in Christian thought, namely God created me and I am good. There is that element in Christianity, which makes sense given their basic premises of, I'm created by God, I'm sinful from my ancestors from Adam and Eve, but I'm the child of God, and therefore there's a spark of dignity in me. There's that element in Christianity too, which is completely missing from the nihilist moderns.
It's accidental.
So we have a few minutes left and a few super chats. Robert Naser has a comment and a question. The comment is no question, just kudos to ARC UK and to Drs. Binswanger and Bernstein for reminding us that rational civil discussions about contentious issues are possible, and our intellectuals are also gentlemen. And
that's the hope, I've been, let me say something about that, because I've been haranguing on Facebook for a couple of years about this, that rational human beings can disagree honestly on all kinds of important issues, including political ones. And the example I always use is, Dr. Leonard Peikoff, who's the world's greatest living philosopher, I respect more than any living person, in 2004 said he thought it was immoral for an objectivist to vote for Bush. We should vote for Kerry. I disagreed respectfully. I voted for Bush. I'd vote for Bush today if he was running against anybody in the Democrats. So we could disagree, on important issues, and we could do it respectfully and reasonably and courteously. So we're not Marxists. Marxists have this class warfare philosophy. They're necessarily malicious. We have a philosophy of reason and freedom and individual rights. We should be much more benevolent in the way we disagree.
And Robert also had a question. Okay, so if objectivists were to ally with the right, what would that look like? What would they do? What would be different? I think we should start with Dr. Bernstein on that, because you're probably more on the side of allying with the right.
The right, left and right. Okay, so by the way, the National Socialism, the so-called alt-right, to me, they're leftists. National Socialism is a form of, right. If these spatial metaphors have any, literal applicability to politics, then right should mean individualism and capitalism, and left should mean collectivism and socialism. Otherwise, I teach my logic students, just jettison these terms and these spatial metaphors, speak in literal terms. Individualism, capitalism, collectivism, socialism. National Socialism, as its name accurately indicates, is a form of socialism. So the alt-right is misnamed. They're the National Socialist left is who they are. So by right, I'm thinking of, religious conservatives who support capitalism. Now, unfortunately, as Harry pointed out, the conservatives are moving towards nationalism, which is a form of collectivism. So that's ominous. There's more for the ominous parallels. But if we're talking about the traditional religious conservatives, then, Rush Limbaugh doesn't have much time left, right? I mean, sadly, I think he's dying. But, people like Mark Levin, Sean Hannity in politics, Kristi Noem, Nikki Haley, people like that, and the religious conservative rank and file who vote Republican. Maybe they think Trump was less bad than the Democrats, but they're not big Trump supporters. As Harry and I were discussing before, I think they're more open to Ayn Rand and objectivism than the left is. And I would talk to them, even buy them copies of The Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged, put the physical books in their hands. And I don't want to harangue them or sound like I'm, a Mooney or some kind of religious zealot, but talk to them about Ayn Rand. If there's any hope for reestablishing freedom in this country, or supporting and defending freedom in this country, it's got to come from Ayn Rand. It doesn't exist anywhere else in the culture. And I think the religious conservatives are more open. Some of them, they're not the Buckley types or the Ann Coulter types, but some of them are more open to reading Ayn Rand and discussing Ayn Rand and considering Ayn Rand than the leftists are. So I would reach out to them with Atlas Shrugged, even put physical copies into people, and tell them it's the story of a man who said he's going to stop the mortar of the world, and then he does. Appeal to them. Read this great novel. It's a great story, and you're going to see, a brilliant philosophy supporting individual rights and freedom that's contained within this story and brilliantly presented. That's how I would appeal to the religious conservatives.
I would say, what does it look like? Not going down the road that Andy went, but taking the question, what would an alliance look like between objectivism and the religious right? It would look like surrender and betrayal. We can't ally with anyone. You may be able to support some candidates. You can vote for them, maybe campaign for them, but you can't ally with any movement. I mean, libertarianism is much closer in many ways than religious conservatives, and we can't ally with them even. We tried, it didn't work. So you have to maintain your brand. Let's look at it in marketing terms. We don't want anyone confusing objectivism with something they've already dismissed. If it's something they already accepted and they confuse objectivism with it, they will learn not to go along with objectivism when they find the differences. But if you're issue-based, like with the left, you join with them for abortion rights. With the right, you join with them for what did they want that I can't even think of anything right now.
Property rights.
They don't say anything about property
They're
rights.
opposed to man-made warming and want to protect.
Yeah,
energy.
yeah, maybe pro-nuclear power if they're the Keystone Pipeline. Take a real concrete. I certainly would favor the building of the Keystone Pipeline. Not that it's an important issue at all. It's kind of symbolic, more than important. But yeah, but I don't think you would ever ally with any other movement in the sense of present a common cause, to the world. There is no common cause.
Harry, there's a way in which I respectfully disagree, and that is if we're talking about individuals, just religious conservative individuals who have the potential to move off center and move from being Christians to being Christian objectivists, then I would do everything I can to reach out to them. Read Ayn Rand, and the more Ayn Rand influence they are, then the more, honestly so, then the more rational they are and the less faith-based they are. And I think they're going to have better lives.
Individual to individual basis.
Yeah,
Get them to read Ayn Rand. That absolutely. And the novels are the best thing. Andy is kind of the Johnny Appleseed of
yeah, thank you.
Right.
Thank you.
And I agree with that. You said that Ayn Rand is the best salesman for objectivism, and you're right. And it's her novels that are responsible for me.
Right. And if that helps us elect candidates like Kristi Noem or Nikki Haley, who are religious but also more liberty-loving than any other Republicans, or certainly more than anybody in Democrats, except maybe Tulsi Gabbard, who's not even in politics anymore. I would certainly support those candidates too, because they're more liberty-loving than the Democrats are, or the other Republicans.
Even though we're officially out of time, we have two more super chat questions that I want to get through quickly. And and let me also thank the people who gave super chats without asking a question. So Mary Aline, Christopher, Kirk, and of course, if I missed anybody, thank you as well. Casey asks, in theory and practice, which suppresses speech more effectively? Which is best at book burning? I guess which is like which side? The left.
Religious conservatives are leftists, you mean?
That's my understanding of the question, yeah.
So it is the Olympics of evil. We can have a book burning contest. I don't think there's any way to answer that. I think whichever one gets the opportunity.
Well, they're certainly both notorious for doing it. But I'm going to stand on what I've said before. I think a free thinker has more chance to survive and triumph under the Christianity at the height of its powers than you will under communism or National Socialism at the height of their powers. One chance out of 100, in contrast to zero chance out of 100. That's how I see it.
I don't agree with that at all.
Well, like I said, there was a medieval Renaissance at the height of Christianity's powers, but not at the height of collectivist powers.
Like I said, there was glasnost and perestroika. And you said, you counter with that's the West's influence, and I counter with the Renaissance was the Arabs' influence. The Arabs had a higher civilization by far than Europe did.
Yeah,
the Arabs had steel, for instance, and silks.
And their philosophy, of course, was communism and Nazism, not Islam, right? I mean, they were religious. Now, Islam
It wasn't the religious Arabs. It was something called philosophe.
I know.
F-I-L-O-S.
I know, but you've proven my point. Islam was the dominant philosophy in the culture and ultimately destroyed the golden age, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But it flourished under Islam for a few centuries, just like the medieval Renaissance, came to be under Christianity, where there's no counterpart for that. For the collective.
But there is. But let's go to another question.
Perestroika and glasnost was good, Harry. I agree with you. It was a surrender of communism.
Yeah.
But it wasn't some golden age or Renaissance.
And what about the freeing up of the Renaissance wasn't some kind of Renaissance at the start either. What about the freeing up of India and China, both of which have incredibly improved? India is still improving. China is now clamping down. They came out of it, and they're going to continue to come out of it.
But I think the better example, like I said, was North Korea, because it's like almost hermetically sealed from
Yeah.
Western influence, and they're not moving
not.
anywhere.
They're not going anywhere.
No, but when there's Western influence, these societies can improve. That's why Ayn Rand showed Anthem to be a completely collectivized world, no freedom anywhere. Makes sense.
So this is interesting because we could free North Korea, I want to say tomorrow, but let's say by next month. If we had moral certainty here, we could go in there, drop leaflets, give them all free iPhones, do a lot of things that would cause the destruction of that regime within weeks. And yet we won't do it because neither the left nor the right has the confidence. The left hates America, and the right thinks that hates Asians, in effect, thinks that America is great for Americans, but the Chinese and the North Koreans and so on don't value freedom and can't value freedom, and we don't like them. Didn't used to be that way, but I think it's become that way.
Well, that may be Trump and the nationalists, but I still think there's a lot of religious conservatives who aren't, racist, or who don't think.
Yeah, sure.
Who think freedom. Even Bush was not much of a president, but he's less bad than the left. But even Bush said, people all over the world yearn for freedom.
Yeah, right. I agree with you, but it's changing for the worse. Okay, we should take the last question because people paid for this.
Yeah. So our last question is kind of off topic, but it does come again from Michael Sanders, and that brings his total up to $160. So thanks again, Michael, for all your support. And the question is, Harry, do you think Florida is significantly freer than New York City?
God, yes. God, yes.
Why did you retire there instead of California? Well, I don't think
you want to know why I went here? The reasons are not philosophically interesting, except that California is choking on its leftism. Florida has no taxes, no state taxes. They have not had a lockdown since April, I think it is. Maybe began to open up in May, and they haven't had a lockdown since then. When the hurricanes come, they react rationally to it. We have a good record on vaccination. Life here is much better politically and ideologically. On the other hand, this morning at coffee at the Sunburst Cafe, I see the Bible breakfast group discussing things at the next table, and it sends shivers down my spine. So it's not nirvana. But compared to New York intellectually, politically, it's much better.
Yeah. And Harry, I just want to point out, I was just in Florida for the last 8 days, and I know you're right, but politically, Florida is more Republican. New York and California are more Democrat and leftist. So the religion has more influence in Florida, as you pointed out, which is the bad news. But it's politically freer than the leftist places for a reason, and that goes back to religion being less oppressive than collectivism.
No, I'm just saying no.
At least that's part of it.
In my view, the reason is that New York is the financial and therefore the publishing and therefore the intellectual center or a center of the world, of America, and therefore it's going to be leftist. So it's not due to the history, except insofar as that shaped New York being the trade center of America. Ayn Rand said that the reason for New York's success and identity is that publishing is here, and publishing is here because money is here. Sounds Marxist the way she didn't quite put it that bluntly.
But I do think around the United States, the red states, which are more religious than the blue states, tend to be freer than the blue states. And they could argue that the blue states are more collectivist than the red states are religious. And
do you think that New Hampshire is more religious than, Massachusetts? I think Massachusetts is a lot more religious than New Hampshire, and New Hampshire is much more Republican than Massachusetts.
Well, used to be anyway. Live free or die.
Well, it's still much more. It's much
Oh, but I
less
mean, well,
democratic.
that may be okay. Let's take that as an exception. But Texas, Florida, South Dakota, where Christy Noem was governor.
Yeah,
South
there's a
Carolina.
correlation of education in the universities with leftism and not religion. So that is true, but it's not. But they're not better because they're religious. They're better because they're less under the influence of the universities.
I agree, but they're less leftist, and part of their philosophy is not Marxism is not a big part of their philosophy. Christianity is. So I think Christianity is in contemporary America. I think it's less virulent than Marxism is.
Well, I never
I
never argued against that position. I think that Marxism is surging, right, and Christianity is not. So we're in agreement on that point. That's not the point of contention. I mean, Marxism, and it doesn't have to be orthodox Marxism, but what we mean by that, the regressive movement, the woke culture is much more powerful and dangerous than in the next 4 years than anything in religious territory.
I agree, 100%. So, Razi, where'd you go? We have more questions?
No, we are done. I want to thank both our speakers for today. Now, Andy, you published your essay last week in Capitalism Magazine.
Yes.
We have the link for that in the description. We'll also put a link in the live chat for your website. You also have a new podcast. Do you want to tell people about that briefly?
Well, The Truth in Politics, Bosch Fawstin and I are going to be standing up for freedom of speech against all of its enemies. Bosch is a real hero. I'm sure you know. He risks his life against the jihadists. So we're going to stand up for freedom of speech and individual rights more broadly against all of its enemies, the conservatives and the jihadists. Although I think the most egregious enemy today is the leftists. So it'd be Friday night, 8:00 Eastern time. And this week, the topic is going to be just the off the charts racism of the left. They like to call their enemies leftist, but what they're doing is simply projecting their own race. They like to call their enemies racist, but what they're really doing is projecting their own racism onto their enemies. So we're going to discuss that on the Truth in Politics this Friday night, 8 p.m. Eastern. And we'll have the link up on my Facebook page for convenience.
And I get a plug too, right?
Yeah, I was just going to say, just to finish with Andy's plug. So I posted your link to your website. Is info on Truth and Politics going to be there as well? Or should I?
It's not there yet. I'll get it there. But if you can post a link to my Facebook page, it's up there.
I will do that.
Thank you,
So the idea for this debate came from the fact that there was a lot of controversy around your essay, and there was a very interesting debate, and I think it's still going on hbletter.com. So, Harry, do you want to tell the audience what that is and why they should sign up?
Well, they should sign up because I get money. But it's hbletter.com. It's HBL is the acronym, but the website is hbletter.com, and it's a subscription-based site which includes not only emails 3 times a week, the best 5, 6, or 7 emails from our forum. You can go to our forum, but there's on Sundays there's Meeting of the Minds, which is a kind of video blog or podcast where I talk and I have guests. So I'm going to have Tara Smith soon, and I'm giving my personal history of what the objectivist movement was like from when I came in '62. A lot of interesting things. That's every Sunday. And it's $12.50 a month to subscribe, but you can have a free 2-week trial subscription just by going to hbletter.com, and you'll see information on the homepage about how to get the free trial. and I'm writing a book on the philosophy of mathematics, and it's almost finished except for the starting.
Well, when that is finished or before that, we hope to have you back here to discuss that. Thank you both, and thanks again to our audience. We, I think, other than a couple of times when we had super chat matches, we today we broke the super chat record. So thanks everybody who contributed to that, and let's break another record. And I encourage everybody to share this so that more people can see it, and let's break our viewership record. This is the type of event that I think non-objectivists will benefit from seeing and might be therefore interested in looking further into objectivism. Thanks again, everybody. We'll be back here as usual every weekday at 6 p.m. UK time, 1 p.m. Eastern with the Daily Objective, and we'll be back on Wednesday with James Valiant to discuss Ayn Rand's essay, Philosophy, Who Needs It? Thank you.
Thanks, Razi, for setting this up. And good talking to you again, Harry.
Right. Thanks to both of you.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.